Good afternoon. My name's Terry O'Malley. I'm the global co-CEO of DLA Piper. And as you heard this morning, this is our 11th Global Real Estate Summit. On behalf of the firm, I'd like to thank all of you, the 600 or so movers and shakers that have come here and made this what I think of as the Woodstock for real estate. So, and one of the best networking opportunities anywhere. We're able to put this kind of an event together because of our outstanding real estate practice with about 175 lawyers here in the U.S. and another 325 outside the U.S. That are tailor-made solutions for complex and interesting business opportunities. And I'd like to recognize the guy whose vision and determination has made this event what it is, Jay Epstein, our global co-chair. But the principal reason I'm up here is not for a commercial break, but to introduce our panel, which is really outstanding. Let me start with our moderator, Peter Roberts. Peter is the Chief Strategy Officer and a member of the Global Executive Committee at Jones Lang LaSalle, where he spent most of his career over the last 30 years. He's responsible for the development and execution of the firm's long-term strategic plan and the pursuit of strategic initiatives for corporate development. He's also an example of the giving back that Jerry Spire talked about this morning, serving on the boards of the Ann and Robert Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, the Board of Trustees of the Ravinia Festival, and the Board of Trustees of the Latin School of Chicago. He's also a current or former member of the Real Estate Roundtable, the Economic Club of Chicago, the Executives Club, the Dartmouth College Real Estate Advisory Council, the Executive Committee of the CARE Program, and the CEOs Against Cancer. Turning to our three panelists, they each exemplify the truism that the more that you've accomplished in life, the less of an introduction you need, but I think you'll find a short introduction inspirational as to each of them. Ambassador Mark Grossman on the far left, my far left. It's not a political comment. Recently rejoined our strategic partners at the Cohen Group after 2 years of service as the U.S. Special Representative to Afghanistan and Pakistan, tasked with managing the diplomatic issues in what's probably been the #1 hotspot in the world over that period of time. Prior to initially joining the Cohen Group in 2005, he spent 29 years in the Foreign Service, including time as the U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, and ultimately Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the #3 position in the State Department. Along the way, he helped marshal diplomatic support for the international response to the attacks of 9/11, helped direct NATO's campaign in Kosovo, and shepherded several rounds of NATO expansion, and over the years has directed the execution of U.S. policy in countless troubled regions around the world. Secretary William Cohen also spent over 30 years in public service, starting as a freshman congressman thrust into the public spotlight during the Watergate hearings. After 3 terms as a congressman, he moved to the Senate and spent the next 18 years as a leader in both domestic and foreign policy, including the Iran-Contra hearings. In 1996, after a string of 6 successful election campaigns, he surprised Washington by announcing he would not stand to re-election due to his increasing frustration with partisan gridlock, and he launched the William S. Cohen Center for International Policy and Commerce at the University of Maine, and prepared for a return to private life, focused on international business in an effort to promote more thoughtful public discourse on national political affairs. But that plan was interrupted when President Clinton asked Bill to lead the Department of Defense, the first time in modern U.S. history that a president chose an elected official from the other party to be part of his cabinet. And Secretary Cohen focused on modernizing our military, reversing a developing trend of recruiting and retention problems in the military, and strengthening our security relationships with countries around the world. in a new post-Cold War era. Under his leadership, the U.S. military conducted the largest air warfare campaign since World War II in Serbia and Kosovo, and conducted military operations on every continent. During his tenure as secretary, he held substantive meetings with the leaders of over 60 nations. He's also served on the board of directors of the Council of Foreign Relations and served on numerous other study groups and committees at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the School for Advanced International Studies, and the Brookings Institute. He's truly a Renaissance man with 11 published works of nonfiction, fiction, and poetry. He's a futurist, but also has degrees in the classics, Latin and Greek, and was a heck of a basketball player in high school and college, named to the New England All-Star Hall of Fame. He also sits on the board at CBS. Senator George Mitchell, Chairman Emeritus of DLA Piper, and well known for a life of distinguished service, most recently including a 2-year stint as President Obama's Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. Truly among the great public servants of our time, Senator Mitchell served as U.S. Attorney for Maine, as a federal district court judge, and then entered the Senate in 1980 as the junior senator from Maine, to another fellow up here on the podium, and went on to be Senate Majority Leader. After leaving the Senate in 1995, President Clinton asked him to undertake what a lot of people thought was a hopeless cause, to go to Northern Ireland and attempt to find a solution to decades of violence and strife. There, he chaired the negotiations of what became known as the Good Friday Accords, leading to what has proven to be an enduring peace in that troubled region. For that service, he received numerous awards and honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor given by the U.S. government. He's been called on time and again to deal with some of the most difficult controversies of our time. In 2000 and 2001, he served as chairman of an international fact-finding committee on violence in the Middle East, issuing what became known as the Mitchell Report, endorsed by the U.S. administration, the European Union, and other governments as a blueprint for future peace in the region. A half dozen years ago, he led the investigation into the use of performance-enhancing drugs in Major League Baseball. Over the years, he's also chaired a special commission on allegations of impropriety and bribery in the Olympic Games. He served as the independent overseer of the American Red Cross Fund to help victims of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He currently acts as the independent monitor tasked with oversight of the efforts of Penn State University to recover from the scandals affecting their athletic programs. He has either currently or previously served as the chairman of the Walt Disney Board of Directors, a member of the board of the Boston Red Sox, for you baseball fans, Federal Express, Xerox, Staples, Unilever, Starwood Hotels, and is the founder of the Mitchell Institute, a scholarship program that's provided more than $8.5 million in financial aid to needy Maine residents seeking a college education. Wasn't quite as short as I thought, but there's your introduction, gentlemen, and Peter, it's all yours. Thank you.
Terry, thank you, and I actually want to echo Ambassador Burns' comments last night and thank the three of you for your service to our country. I mean, it's really amazing hearing what you've been able to accomplish and help us further the agenda both here and abroad. But I want to start with what appears to be the biggest bugaboo, and that is the political climate in Washington, and specifically its impact on American business. In the survey that DLA Piper sent out to attendees of the conference, the number one response to the question, what can the U.S. do to get its fiscal house back in order, by the attendees here, was eliminate political gridlock. And in an editorial in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, the CEO and chairman of the Vanguard Group came out and wrote that the Vanguard Group has calculated that policy uncertainty in the U.S. has created a $261 billion drag on the economy. In other words, since 2011, the economy would have grown at 3% annually versus the 2% recorded if we didn't have this political gridlock and policy uncertainty. So the question is, given the paralysis in the legislative process and the attendant relationship between the White House and Congress, is there any way to get Washington back on track and playing a more productive role to help the U.S. economy? Senator Mitchell?
Well, let me begin with a story of bipartisanship. how I was elected the Democratic Majority Leader of the Senate thanks to Senator Cohen, a Republican member of the Senate. Now you ask, how did a Republican senator get a Democrat elected to the Senate? I was initially appointed to the Senate, as you heard Terry's introduction. I then became the junior senator to my senior, Bill Cohen. We appeared jointly often throughout the state and in Washington, and in every instance, he spoke first, he spoke at great length,
As was appropriate.
and when he finished, he would always say, I've got to go to an important meeting, so I can't stay to hear Senator Mitchell speak. And he'd get up and leave. And it was frustrating for me. This went on for years. Then, about the time that the Senate Majority Leader announced he wasn't going to run again, Senator Cohen spoke at a launching of a big Navy cruiser at the Bath Iron Works in Maine. It's the largest employer in Maine, and the launchings are huge events. Tens of thousands of people go. And he'd been at every one. I had never been invited. So I called the president of the company, who's a friend of mine. I said, listen, Senator Cohen speaks at every launching, and you never asked me to come. I'd like to come sometime. He said, well, let me ask you a question. He said, you are the junior senator from Maine. Not exactly a nobody, but not many people know who you are. He said, Senator Cohen is the chairman of the Sea Power Committee on the Armed Services Committee. He said, if you were me, who would you invite to launch your ship? Well, there was a practice of doing one in the summer, which attracted a big crowd, and one in the middle of February, which attracted a very small crowd. He said, but I'll tell you what. He said, I'll look at next February's schedule and see if we can fit you in. So a few weeks later, he called me. He said, it works out well. He said, Senator Cohen is tied up in February. He can't come. So you come and you give the speech at the launching. So it was the middle of February. I went. It was about 20 degrees below zero. A modest crowd was present. And at these launchings, they have to be done at a precise moment because of the tides. And this launching was set for 1:16 p.m. And literally at that moment, a loud whistle blows and the ship starts down and the program is over. So when I get up on the podium, sitting down like this next to the president, I look over down the end on the other side. Who do I see but Senator Cohen? So I said to the president, what's he doing here? He said, what can I say? He told us he was going to be tied up, but then he just showed up today, and he's the chairman of the Sea Power Committee. What can I do? I said, well, nothing. He promised me he'd give a short talk. So the program started. Senator Cohen was called upon. At 1:15 and 30 seconds, he completed his remarks and sat down. So just as I stood up, the whistle blew, the ship was launched. That night, he flew back to Washington on a Navy jet. I flew coach commercial, and I pondered my fate. Am I going to spend the rest of my life playing second fiddle to this guy? How can I become first in the speaking order? And then it occurred to me, why don't I run for Senate Majority Leader? That's how it was. If you want to respond now or later.
I think I'll leave. We got an important meeting.
Well, political dysfunction. It is, of course, a matter of great concern. When we served, it wasn't that many years ago, we thought it was tough. It was political, it was hard. American politics have always been rough and tumble, but it is clearly much worse now. It's easier to diagnose the problem than it is to come up with a solution. But I think among the factors, and I don't purport to be a political expert, first is money. The amount of money pouring into the American political system now is increasing exponentially. when I was Senate Majority Leader, I was so frustrated that I took a monthly block calendar and I blew it up about the size of the screen up there. And it was all black except for a few slivers of white. And I had a meeting of senators, and I said to them, I come into the office every morning, and I have at least a dozen or 24 phone calls from senators waiting for me, asking, don't have a fundraiser at noon, don't have a vote at noon because I have a fundraiser. Don't have a vote at 4 because I have a fundraiser. 5, 6, 7, 8. And I pointed to the calendar and I said, see, the only time we could vote if I acceded to all your requests of fundraisers is 2 to 4 a.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And it's much worse now. And so I think money clearly is a huge factor. So senators and congressmen are engaged in a really demeaning, disgraceful, mad chase for money, and I'm sure all of you are among the recipients of dozens of invitations to attend, but it does distract from their efforts, but more importantly, it has severed the bond of trust between the American people and their elected representatives, which is so essential for an effectively functioning democracy. Let me ask just a couple of questions here. Does anyone here believe that members of Congress are more responsive to their constituents than they are to their donors? Anybody believe that? Not one. Let me read you just 2 statements. Independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or to the appearance of corruption. The appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. Does anybody believe that? Those are direct quotations taken from the Citizens United case and represent the premises on which that case was decided. The fact is that the amount of money is titanic and overwhelms the system. And I don't think the problem is specific bribery. If you, Peter, will vote this way on that issue, I'll pay you $100,000. It's slightly more subtle than that, but it does contribute, I think, greatly. Gerrymandering. When you go back to your rooms, look at page 12 of the Chicago Tribune today, an entire page devoted to the question, pointing out how gerrymandering has affected elections to the House. In the last election, one noted expert in Washington reported that fewer than 50 seats in the House were truly competitive, as between Democrats and Republicans. The competitive moment is the primary. And as we all know, the nominating process involves far fewer citizens than does the general election process, and gives a hugely disproportionate influence to the activists on both sides who tend to be more ideologically committed, more extreme in their positions, less willing to compromise. And so the members who get elected know that that's their constituency, or the phrase goes, that's their base these days, and is to that base that they are responsive in their positions. I don't think it'll change until there is some control over the amount of money, and I don't see any prospect in the immediate future for that happening. And until redistricting is not on a purely partisan basis, as it is now on both sides. The Tribune article today cites one example of Democratic gerrymandering, which happens to be Illinois, and another of Republican gerrymandering, which happens to be North Carolina in the last election, and describes how it functions. And most importantly, it won't happen until the American people demand that it stops. Right now, although people don't like the dysfunction and they don't like the process, they are not moved enough to change it. And it won't be until I think there's some kind of an unfortunate financial scandal or something like that that will galvanize public opinion and cause people to demand change. There are many other factors, but I think those contribute to it, and I must say that I'm not optimistic about immediate change.
Well, it's interesting because all of us know Tom Friedman, who wrote The World is Flat. In his book, That Used to Be Us, co-written by author Michael Mandelbaum, the authors pose the argument that because of this political paralysis, we can't enact the public policies the country needs to make our economy competitive and to maintain our position on the global stage. And I'm interested, Secretary Cohen, from your perspective, do you buy that argument? And is there anything we can do to get back on the right track?
Well, it's very discouraging in terms of looking at the words that would sum it up: stalemate, stagnation, and I would say even stupidity on our part when we are unable to reach an agreement on the budget. The discussion that took place last year, and then it ended up the Congress couldn't agree on arriving at a budget to cut $1.2 trillion out of the debt on an annual, on a 10-year basis. And so we said, well, maybe 12 people could get together, just 12 of us, a little more than this table. 12 people, 6 and 6, get together and come up with $1.2 trillion. And they will, of course, but if they don't, we'll have the hammer come down and we'll have sequestration. Everyone thought that was unthinkable. Guess what? 12 people couldn't agree. And so sequestration became a reality, and it's now starting to have a major impact in terms of certainly how we spend our defense dollars. But also having an impact in terms of how we appear to other people. Now, Tom Friedman's book was really written with Michael Mendelbaum, and he was comparing what was taking place in China. He had just come from a conference in China. He went to one of their new convention centers, and he saw that a convention center with all of the escalators and elevators that went with it was built in a period, I think, of 18 months. And he then was back in Bethesda, Maryland, and there is a metro station in which 2 of the escalators were out. It took 8 months to fix 2 escalators. And he was drawing a comparison saying, you know, what they're doing in China in terms of having a vision of where they want to get to and then being able to execute, well, that used to be us. And so he's saying we don't have to be like China. We want to be the way we used to be. Because other countries, whether we're talking about the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and others, they want to be like us, like we used to be. And what's happening as a result of this stalemate and stagnation or paralysis is that we're unable to make decisions. And other countries look at that, and they tend to lose some confidence in our political system as we are promoting our system to other countries. And certain irony involved in that, saying, look at us, we have liberty and freedom, et cetera, but they look at us and say, but you're not making any decisions. So it's what Friedman was talking about is we've got to get back to some of the core principles that made us the greatest force for good on the planet. And he talked about investing in education, one of the core principles. Immigration, allowing much greater immigration than we have in attracting really bright people coming in and attending our universities and high-tech schools. Investing in research and development, another core principle. Investing in infrastructure. I just, coming out to Chicago, I had to go to the airport in Washington, going along Canal Road, came up to the bridge, Key Bridge. All of the cement that's visible on the bridge was crumbling. And I thought, wow, what a sight that is for people to come and see the nation's capital. At the bridge, the surface of it is crumbling. What is happening underneath? And this gets back to what Friedman was talking about in terms of we're not investing in our infrastructure. So if we want to be great, if we want to hold ourselves up as the greatest country on the planet in terms of our values and our core principles, we've got to get back to them. That used to be us. It's no longer us. Now, with Senator Mitchell, given his lengthy explanation, you can see why I wanted to go first all the time. But what Senator Mitchell was saying is that we've got a problem in that it has become such an ideologically pure battle today. There's no center any longer. Even though Senator Mitchell was a very liberal Democrat and Bob Dole was a very conservative Republican, the two of them worked together very closely and were able to do things. That no longer is the case, and the word Senator Mitchell used was compromise. The word compromise has been poll tested. It apparently means weakness, lack of principle, and to be avoided at all costs. So you can talk about it only in the sense that I'm willing to work for common interests or some kind of common ground, but we won't compromise. So that's a problem we have. You no longer have a willingness to reach across the aisle to say, let's make a deal. All of you are in the business of making deals. You don't get 100% of what you want. Hopefully both parties or tri-parties will come out with most of what they want. We no longer are willing to settle for most of what we want. We want all of what we want, and that is part of the problem. I don't know how it changes until one party becomes so dominant, either on the left or the right, that you don't have to worry about whether you got 60 votes or not. You simply control both the presidency and the Congress. That may be the only way that you'll see this division that's producing stalemate right now. In the short term, I don't see much change. In the long term, that may happen.
Ambassador Grossman referenced the global stage that Friedman's book and talks about. I want to go a bit to foreign policy and why foreign policy should matter to this audience. I mean, members of both the Republican and the Democratic Party, there are isolationists that argue we should focus on rebuilding our economy and not on rebuilding the economies of foreign nations. And in the focus on sequestration cuts, there's been a great deal of focus on the military. But as is often said, military should always be the last option after all diplomatic options have been exhausted. What are the implications of the sequestration cuts on the State Department and our diplomats abroad? I mean, is it a zero-sum game? And are we at risk because of the sequestration cuts from a foreign policy perspective? And why should that matter to American business?
Well, Peter, first of all, thank you very much. Before I do anything else, I think what both senators have said here is really important. We have two senators and a diplomat. And people would say, well, maybe I have a different perspective on this. I want to tell you, first of all, that the most important thing, the most important power an American diplomat has abroad is the strength of our country domestically. And so there is, for me, no distinction between the desire to get right our own power, get right our own economy, and do the kinds of things that both senators have talked about. Because if you represent the United States abroad, you represent the United States, and that has to be a powerful United States. And so I don't think there's any distinction at all between the desire to get our economy right, to get our finances fixed, to do the kinds of things that Senator Cohen just talked about, because it empowers our diplomacy abroad. And those people who say, well, you have to fix the American economy, it has no relationship to foreign policy, that's absolutely wrong. Second thing is, that I think is very important, is when you kind of say, when you say to me, well, will sequestration have this impact on our diplomacy? Yes, it will. We've been very lucky in American diplomacy these last 15 or 20 years. Secretary Powell, Secretary Rice, Secretary Clinton, supported by presidents of both parties, have built up the diplomatic function of the United States of America, and supported also by the House and the Senate. And so we are in very good shape in terms of the people that we have and the money that we have. The question is diplomacy going to continue to be important going forward? I would argue it's going to be more important than ever. And so we have to be careful as the sequestration hits, not to erode and not to get rid of all of the gains that we've made over these past few years. You know, when I think about my career, I joined the Foreign Service in 1976. And the big deal was, of course, the Soviet Union. And we worked on the Soviet Union. The world was divided between the Soviet Union and the United States. And that's what people did. They observed, they reported, they worked on this issue. And we look around the world today, and what do we ask our diplomats to do? We're asking our diplomats to do all kinds of things that don't have anything to do with observing and reporting, but they require action. And it's that kind of infrastructure on the diplomatic side that's so important to protect. The third question you asked, I think, is also a very important one, which is, so what does it matter? You know, why should a foreign policy for the United States of America be a strong one, be a successful one? What's it matter to American business? And I have to say the answer was in every single panel that I listened to this morning. We listened to the first panel about the challenges of doing business abroad, about the need for rule of law, about the need for the kind of infrastructure abroad to allow American companies to be successful. We talked about a little bit last night, and talked about setting the conditions for your success. And when I think about a group like this one that looks out and says, well, is it a good or a bad thing if the United States of America negotiates a free trade agreement, for example, with the European Union? Again, I can't speak for all of your businesses, but I'd imagine for most of you here, it'd be a very positive thing. And the same with the partnership in the Pacific. And so in these cases, kind of setting the conditions for your success is a very important part of our foreign policy. One of the things we've tried to do at the Cohen Group is sort of help American businesses do business abroad. And what's the first place we go to try to get that done? Well, we go to the American Embassy. We go to our representatives abroad because they represent you as well in that regard. And so this foreign policy piece of this matters very much. And then finally, it matters because it doesn't just set the conditions for your success, it sets the conditions for ultimately the continuation of America's success. You know, Madeleine Albright and Nick talked a little bit about it last night. America's the indispensable nation. That's a hard thing to be, but not much gets done in this world unless the United States is involved in it. And we need to continue to have that power, first based on our domestic strength, secondly on the power of our diplomacy, and third, this capacity for understanding that that the conditions for our success will lead the conditions for yours.
Peter, if I could make a comment on the question you asked Senator Cohen and I. It is fashionable and justified to criticize our elected officials for the political dysfunction or gridlock. But it is not the whole picture. And all of us as individuals, as citizens, bear some responsibility for that. A society as a whole, like individuals, regularly holds and advocates contradictory views. The polls show consistently, for example, that the American people overwhelmingly disapprove of negative television advertising in political campaigns. And the same polls show that they are overwhelmingly moved and persuaded by them. And when people say we want you to solve it, what they really mean is we want you to solve it our way. I'll tell a story about that. In my first term as Senate Majority Leader, President George H.W. Bush was in office. We had a terrible struggle over the budget. It lasted a year and a half. It was very partisan. Much of the same criticism that you hear now was heard then, and many of the issues were the same, whether the deficit would be reduced by cuts alone or by a combination, where the spending should be cut and so forth. After several months of this, I used to go home every weekend and hold open town meetings. And I had a meeting in a suburban community in southern Maine that was quite well attended, disproportionately elderly. And the first person who got up, I invited statements and questions, was a well-dressed, articulate man who proceeded to harshly criticize me. Said he'd voted for me, he'd never do it again. He was embarrassed at the partisan manner in which I was behaving in these fights with the president. He said, it's terrible, all this politics. He said, the president's got a home just a few miles from here in Kennebunk. Why don't you go over there and, for once, act like a gentleman and settle this in a proper way? And when he finished, the crowd stood and gave him a thunderous round of applause, endorsing his condemnation of me. Then he said, that's my statement, here's my question. He said, what are you guys fighting about? What are the issues? He said, you can't figure it out, it's all politics. Well, interestingly, the issues were similar, and one of the big ones was Medicare funding. The president had made a proposal. We thought it would change the nature of the system. We supported reductions, but in a different way. I explained that to him. The guy got up. He said, Senator, this is a representative democracy. You represent us, and we're telling you, you go back and don't give an inch on Medicare. And the crowd got up and gave him a double standing ovation. So I went back with two very clear messages. The problem was, of course, they were directly contradictory. So we're all in this together, and it'll take an aroused public to get it solved. And when the public focuses on and reaches a conclusion that the problem needs solving and what the solution is, then the politicians will act.
Yeah. Well, keeping with the foreign policy theme, I want to switch to a place that is a hotbed of conflict now, which is the Middle East. And it seems on an inexorable rise of conflict throughout the region. And why don't we just start with an overview of kind of the perspective on what's happening in the region. Senator Mitchell.
At this event last year, we discussed specifically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I think we should again. And right now, of course, Syria and Iran are very much in the news, along with Egypt. There's a lot of turbulence. I think it's important to put this in the larger context, which I think will be decisive over the next several decades in determining what happens in the region and in terms of our policy. There are right now 3 separate but overlapping and intersecting conflicts occurring within the world of Islam. These have been going on for 1,400 years since its founding, and they are accelerating now for a variety of reasons, some of which I'll comment on. The first, of course, is the Sunni-Shia division, which began in the contest for succession to the Prophet Muhammad. The second is a conflict between what generally are called moderates and radicals that exist throughout Islam, and they are not identical with the Sunni-Shia split. Within both Sunni and Shia traditions, there are some radicals and some moderates. And the third is that this is a generalization, but it's largely true. In most of those countries, there is a 3-way competition for power between the established governments, which to a significant degree are either military dictatorships or monarchies, non-democratic regimes, and an opposition that is divided largely into 2 general groups, the Islamists and what, for want of a better description, I would call secular, Western-oriented people who believe in democracy. And what we've seen so far in both Egypt, Syria, and in other countries is that among the opponents, the Islamists tend to be better organized, more disciplined, historically better fighters, and the secular groups tend to be less so in that regard. Now, that's an important issue now because it envelops the whole region and has a direct effect on Israeli-Palestinian affairs, on what happens in Iran, Egypt, and elsewhere. 1 out of 5 people on earth today is Muslim. That's about 1.2 billion out of 7 billion. That means it's a problem that is of major consequence. But within just a few decades, when the population of the earth reaches between 9.5 and 10 billion people, just a few decades away, 1 out of 3 persons on earth will be Muslim. There will be 3.5 billion Muslims on earth just after the middle of this century. That's equal to the total population of the world as recently as 1965. How these conflicts play out, what the results are, will have a decisive effect on the geopolitics, not just of that part of the world, but of the entire world, and particularly with respect to what American policy ought to be, directly affecting Israel and its continued existence and security, directly affecting, as we all know, the vast amounts of petroleum products and natural gas that flow out of that region and have a direct effect on economies around the world. We have to figure out a way to provide support and encouragement to the moderates, not in a way that suggests that we control the futures of others, but in a way that suggests that we can influence them, particularly those who share our values and our aspirations, even as we continue to play a high level and aggressive role in interdicting, opposing, and combating terrorist and terrorist actions. It's a huge task. I think we're up to it, but the leaders of our country of the next few generations, next few decades, will have no more important foreign policy task than to discern when is it appropriate in our national interest to directly intervene, military or otherwise, and when it is not. Because whoever the American president is, for the next 30 or 40 years, is going to be asked regularly to go here, go there, do this, do that. These conflicts don't end overnight. In our country, it took 8 years between the time the fighting ended and the time our country was established as a democracy. In France, 75 years. In England, centuries. And we can look forward to what is occurring now as the new norm, something we have to deal with more effectively and more with greater farsightedness and vision than we've done so far.
Well, the difference is today that we don't have that much time, given the proliferation of weapons that can bring about horrific catastrophe. And so to take 75 years to see something unfold in the past will be compressed into a very much shorter period of time. And that's one of the real dangers that we're seeing take place with the fear, for example, in Syria. Did he or did he not use chemical weapons? And if he did, what do we do about it? These are issues that the president now is wrestling with because he initially said if you use a chemical or biological weapon, that crosses a red line. So now the issue has been raised, did he cross the red line? And if so, and there seem to be several countries who have concluded that, what does the United States intend to do about it? And that's the problem that the president has, because you heard last night Ambassador Burns as well saying others are watching us. The North Koreans are watching what we do when we say there's a red line. Iran is watching what we do when we say there's a red line, and he just crossed it. And if we do nothing, then that gives them a pretty good incentive to continue to do what they're doing. If we do something, the something then becomes important to determine what is it exactly that you hope to achieve. What would be the mission that you would carry out in going after Assad? Exactly, is it feasible? Well, we know he has one of the most sophisticated air defense systems supplied to him by Russia. Can we take it out as easily as we took out the air defense systems, let's say, of Saddam Hussein, or in Libya, or elsewhere, in Bosnia, Kosovo? And if not, if you've got mobile systems that are going to be placed in large urban areas, you're going to take them out as well and kill a lot of people in the process. So is it feasible, militarily feasible? Is it, what are the costs in terms of treasure and blood? And how do we get out? And as we found over the last few years, getting in is a lot easier than getting out. So these are all the issues weighing on what Senator Mitchell just talked about, the overlay of all of the underlying tensions, religious and secular, modern versus ancient, playing out. And what role do we play in supporting the moderate regimes, many of whom in the region want us to get involved, whether it's UAE or Qatar or Saudi Arabia or others, or Jordan? They all want us to do something. It's the something that we haven't quite resolved. What do we do under these circumstances, given the fact that no other country can do what we can do? Our allies are, their budgets have been cut deeply. And we saw during the Libya campaign, by way of example, that even though we took the initiation in reducing the air defense system of Gaddafi, we turned it over to NATO, and within 2 days, NATO ran out of ammunition. So the question becomes, is this the United States going to take unilateral action and once again get engaged in a third war with an Arab country? So no easy answer to that, but that's what the president is pondering, and that's what Senator Mitchell is talking about. It's very complex, it's layered, and we have to have an understanding of the history as well as some notion of where it is unfolding as we go forward and how we manage our diplomacy, which I'm now going to turn it over to Ambassador Grossman to answer.
Well, let me ask you a question where you've just gotten back from 2 years speaking of diplomacy.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll get back to the Middle East if we have time. But you've just spent 2 years working on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And can you share for us what's at stake in that part of the world and what we can expect going forward?
Peter, thank you. What's at stake, I think, is a lot of what both Senator Mitchell and Secretary Cohen have just talked about. You know, when I consider the question of what did I spend my last 2 years doing, first, I think it's right that President Obama, supported by Congress, by the American people, we're in this now in Afghanistan to responsibly end this war. And by December of 2014, the Afghans will be in security lead all around Afghanistan. The number of U.S. forces there will be small. The president yet has to decide what number that will be. This is going to be a completely different fight in December of 2014. But I think about what it matters and what's there and why it continued. I'll give you 3 possibilities. First, I do think we have to keep coming back and back and back to the question of terrorism, which is to say that this idea that we are fighting in Afghanistan and want the Afghans to succeed so that Afghanistan will never again be a platform on which terrorists can attack the United States or its friends or our allies, that's an important foreign policy objective for the United States of America. Second thing I found over the 2 years that I had this responsibility was the other thing that's really important right now as Secretary Cohen just said, is how do you get out? And how do you get out in such a way so that you not just protect, but allow Afghans to fight for some of the really serious and important gains that they've made over the past 10 or 11 years at huge cost to them and, of course, to the United States and friends and allies. I'll give you a couple of examples. 2003, there were 900,000 Afghan children in school, all boys. There are today 8 million Afghan children in school, 40% of whom are girls. In 2003, the average life expectancy of a male in Afghanistan was 42. Today it's 60. 120,000 cell phones in Afghanistan in 2003, 16 million today. So a lot of things yet to be done in Afghanistan, but there are things there that Afghans will now have to fight for. And the question is, can we manage our exit from Afghanistan in a way that allows them to have the wherewithal to do that fighting? And third is the effort to try to bring some end to 30 years of conflict in Afghanistan. And part of the job that I was given was to see if that were possible. And I must say that I took as my inspiration the work that Senator Mitchell had done in Northern Ireland. And you may not remember, but there was a quotation that we used again and again in trying to convince people that it was time to end this war, which is that people start wars, people can end them. And one of the things that we have to arrange as we depart Afghanistan is to see if we can support much of a peace process as possible. Second thing I think that's important, and Senator Mitchell makes this point, is that in Pakistan today, you see this conflict, Shia-Sunni. You see the internal conflicts all throughout that society. And something that Americans ought to pay attention to is there's going to be an election in Pakistan next month. And I don't know what will happen. I don't know who will win. But people are going to go to the polls in Pakistan. And if that polling is successful, which I believe that it will be the first time in Pakistan's history that an elected parliament will have finished its term, there had been an election, and a new parliament will take over. And if you're looking for answers for how we manage countries that are in these kind of conflicts, like the conflict in Pakistan, democracy and tolerance and pluralism are an important part of this. And so watch this election carefully, because it will tell you a lot about the future of the region. And third, we learned over the 2 years that it's not possible for the United States, friends, allies, taxpayers, to continue to just give aid and aid and aid and aid to these countries forever. And that when you go to Pakistan and Afghanistan, the overwhelming need is that people need a job in these places. And the only way these jobs will come is through private sector investment, foreign direct investment. And so we created this idea of trying to create a new Silk Road to connect Central Asian economies and South Asian economies. And I don't recommend that any of you kind of rush out to invest in Afghanistan or Pakistan tomorrow, but the idea that these economies need to form the foundation for their strength, just as our economy forms the foundation of ours, is extremely important. And so what's out there at stake is Afghans fighting for what they've had the opportunity to create, Pakistanis moving to some tolerant and pluralistic and successful society, and as I say, watch this election. And third, with the support of the private sector, some future for these countries that's regional and that's fueled and based by jobs and the capacity of people to make choices about their own lives. And when I look back on the 2 years, and I think as you look back on the effort that we've made there, if we can keep this counterterrorism piece in front of us and try to accomplish these other things, that sacrifice though it has been in a terrible, terrible way, both individually and collectively, that these are the kinds of things that we hope we can answer in some useful way as being of some utility to the United States.
Let me make a comment on what Bill said. I agree with him on the urgency. It is, in fact, the threat of the complete collapse of the nuclear non-proliferation regime that is a major reason why Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. There are only 9 countries with such weapons. Iran is trying, including North Korea, Iran is trying hard to make it number 10. We have been quite successful in our country in persuading large numbers of countries who have the capability to produce nuclear weapons to refrain from doing so in reliance on our policies and on the non-proliferation regime. If that breaks down, you could have, in my judgment, you'll certainly have in the Middle East a nuclear arms race, which could easily bleed into Asia, and the number of countries with nuclear weapons would go from 9 to 29 or even more in a relatively short period of time. That's a huge risk. On Syria, I'll just make the further comment that I frankly applaud the President's caution and prudence in deciding what action to take in this circumstance. We all recognize that the last thing in the world the United States needs is a third war in that region. Now, with respect to the chemical weapons, it's a tangled and complicated circumstance in which it's very fact-specific. The first public accusation to the UN of the use of chemical weapons was made by the government of Syria, alleging that the opposition had used it, and Syria asked the UN to investigate on the grounds that this was a plant to lead the United States, to draw the United States in. Now, the Assad regime is a brutal dictatorship which has lied repeatedly, and there's no reason to believe that they're telling the truth in this circumstance. But the UN went to Syria initially for the purpose of investigating the allegation that it was the opposition that had used chemical weapons. Before they got there, another allegation arose that in a separate instance, the government had used it. So the UN took the position that if it's there to investigate one, it had to investigate both. The Syrian government objected, saying you're limited to the grounds on which we invited you here, and they're at a stalemate now. People who have been there in recent weeks and recent days aren't certain of exactly what occurred. And an action that we take that might trigger drawing us in further requires a solid factual basis and, to the extent humanly possible, knowing exactly what did or did not occur before we make a critical judgment that could lead to other events in the future. I don't disagree at all with Bill's assessment. In fact, I share it. But I think it's important to understand that the facts are not at all clear here, and there have been many articles about inappropriate tactics used by both sides in the conflict and the growing predominance of al-Qaeda and other affiliated groups in the opposition. In the end, I think it's clear that Assad cannot remain as head of the government there. Any government that is responsible for the deaths of as many as 70,000 of its citizens has no legitimacy and no authority to act, and I think they will go. The question is how and under what circumstances, and most critically, what will follow when they go? What will occur? This is not an easy question. History is filled with examples of very bad governments being removed by violent revolution and then being replaced by much worse governments. There is no guarantee that a removal of this dictator, this brutal dictator, is going to produce a Jeffersonian democracy. I think we ought to be clear about that.
Well, Ambassador Grossman and Senator Mitchell, you both covered parts of the world where the tensions and the ramifications for all global citizens, not just the U.S., are hanging in the balance. I want to turn to a third part of the world where the opportunity is there, but also is replete with tension, and that is China, with whom we enjoy a symbiotic relationship, but one that is often filled with tension. And my question is, how best do we manage that relationship for our interests across things like trade, diplomacy, and most recently, cybersecurity? And Secretary Cohen, I know you just got back from China recently. Can you give us a perspective on that?
Well, I first went to China in 1978, and in Beijing they had one hotel. It was initially called the Peking Hotel, became the Beijing Hotel. They had one hotel, one store called the American Friendship Store. If you go to Beijing today, you've seen quite a change. And they had no cars, by the way, all bicycles. So it's pretty awe-inspiring to see what the Chinese people, their government, has been able to do in 35 years' time. It's awe-inspiring and a bit intimidating as well to see how they can marshal their people and have a vision and, with Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernizations, get there. What's taking place today, as they have grown economically to be number 2 in the world, is that their military is the last part of that that quartet of modernizations. And so the military is now getting stronger. They spend admittedly, about $120 to $30 billion a year. I can tell you that if that figure it's on the low end in all probability, but that goes a lot further. Their $100 billion goes a lot further than our $100 billion, given the fact that they don't have an all-volunteer force. But in any event, they're getting bigger and they're getting stronger. As a result of their getting stronger, they are running into what Joe Nye was mentioned last night by Ambassador Burns once wrote called the paradox of power. He wrote about the paradox of American power. There's a paradox of Chinese power as well. As they are starting to flex their muscle throughout the East and South China Seas, the other countries in the region are getting more apprehensive. And therefore, they are starting to ask the United States to play an even more visible role. President Obama talked about pivoting. And many of us criticize the use of the word pivot because it's been misinterpreted by many, but shifting our focus to the Asia-Pacific region, well, we've never really shifted it away. We've been preoccupied with Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, but we've never really left the Asia-Pacific region, and as a result of American presence in the region, guess what? China's been able to grow to the extraordinary extent they have. So now they're running into the paradox. When they start to flex this power and to show it, other countries react, and so the United States is being called upon to play a bigger role. What are we doing? We are putting 2,500 Marines in Australia, in Darwin. We are putting 4 what they call littoral combat ships, LCSs, in Singapore. We are beefing up our relationship in the Philippines. We're strengthening our relationship with Japan. That's another whole issue, by the way, what's taking place in Japan, which appears to be becoming certainly more nationalistic. But we're strengthening our relationship with Japan, and for the first time, Japan is now starting to increase its defense spending, and we are contributing to that increase as well. So the Chinese take a look at this activity, and they say, this pivot is really an attempt to encircle us. You call it pivot, we see it as a containment policy. So we've got our work cut out for us. I think the Chinese leadership is sincere. They have a brand new leadership. They're moving new people in. They are sincere in wanting a very strong bilateral relationship with the United States. They know it's critically important that together we can do very important things on issues that affect all of us. And they want this relationship really to succeed. So it's going to take lots of diplomacy on our part, lots of engagement, lots of meeting of our diplomats, but also our military. Our military-to-military relationships have not been where they need to be. There's still a level of strategic mistrust, and we don't exactly trust them, and they don't trust us, and we've got to reduce that distrust and find ways in which we can engage in peaceful activities, humanitarian rescue missions, what they call tabletop exercises. But we have to reduce that because the danger is that there'll be a miscalculation somewhere along the line because the Chinese want to push us further away from their shoreline. They would like to claim greater control over the South China Sea, to be sure. And they are still worried that we have in mind containing their rise to a powerful position in global affairs. So it can be done, and it has to be done. This is I think Ambassador Burns had it just right last night. This is probably the most important relationship we'll have for the next several decades. And I think that we have to resist the temptation to turn to the Chinese and try to see them as the new Soviet Union. We have big issues to resolve with them, one of them being cyber attacks. And this is something we can spend, I know we're over our time right now, but spend a lot of time on because this is surfaced as one of the major issues affecting our relationship. When Senator Mitchell and I were in the United States Senate, we were in the Cold War at that time. And we had to have policies. We analyzed them in terms of here we are, the two major nuclear powers staring at each other on a hair trigger of extinction practically. And we had to think about what should our policy be. Should we launch on warning? If the Soviets were going to thinking about attacking us and we had adequate warning, should we launch upon warning? Should we launch while we're under attack, or should we wait until we've absorbed the first attack and then strike back? Well, these are the kind of strategic concepts that were floating around at that time. Think about it in the context now of cyber activity, where another country or a group within a country can actually shut down your critical infrastructure and can do it in a way which you'll never be able to respond. So then the temptation becomes, shouldn't we kind of launch our own cyber attack upon warning? How good does that warning have to be? Should we wait until we see a certain level of activity? These are things that really have to be discussed, and they have to be discussed behind closed doors, certainly initially. But we've got to establish this kind of relationship with China and other countries. But that's where the activity seems to have been reported most recently, and it's something that can, in fact, derail our relationship, because members of Congress are going to look at that and say, you see, we can't trust the Chinese. They're stealing everything. They're threatening to shut down our critical infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So this relationship has to be broad-based. We have to continue to trade with the Chinese. We need to have more trade with their investment coming in and make it easier for them to invest in the United States in many instances. And to establish these trading bonds and this military-to-military relationship, our diplomats with a strategic economic dialogue, which is critically important, and we can work our way through these more challenging times. But I think that this relationship is key to their success in the future, and they have problems. We talked about it this morning. Sam Zell was talking about the pollution levels becoming a health issue, which could, in fact, destabilize their country if people start rising up and saying, we can't live like this anymore. They're locked into a conundrum right now. They have to grow at 7.5% to 8%. They were at 12%. They're now at 7.5%, maybe a little bit less. They have to continue to grow at least that level, and they're still relying principally upon coal and oil. And so they're locked in for the next 10, 15, 20 years into this environmental conundrum that they have, with all of the health-related issues and all of the potential for discontent that could manifest themselves. So this is, China has an incredible country, incredible people, and much to be admired about them and much to criticize, but I think we have to have this relationship, has to succeed.
Well, I want to turn it over. I know we're budging up against timeline, but if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question, now would be a great opportunity to do so. There's one over in the corner. Marty?
Thank you for a great talk. I know that this is going to be an easy question to talk, and I understand you don't like to speculate, but could I ask each of you to look 3 to 5 years ahead and give us your best judgment about what we will see in Iran, in Syria, and the Israelis and Palestinians?
The question is, can you all whip out your own individual crystal ball and predict in the next 3 to 5 years what we'll see in Iran, Syria, and with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Fair, Marty?
Go ahead, Mark.
All right.
Go ahead, Mark.
Please.
You're sitting closest to the questioner.
Yeah. 5 years is an awful long time. I'd say that in that near term, on Arab Israel, I would hope that all of the things that we've been talking about today would sort of focus minds there on the need to make some progress and get this problem sorted out. I think Secretary Cohen said to me this morning, you know, we need you on this panel because we need you to be optimistic. People tend to think that diplomats are pessimists. Diplomats are generally optimists, because why else would you get up every morning and try to solve these problems? And I'd like to think that the sort of geopolitical, demographic changes in the area will open up minds, at least in Israel, Palestinians, to get something done over the next couple of years that they haven't tried in the past. Senator Mitchell, of course, knows much more about this than I do. On Iran, I think we have to stay really strong. I think the only way that the Iranians will come to the conclusion that the path they're on is the wrong one is if we stay steady and we keep focused on the sanctions, we keep focused on the international community, we keep the relationships with China, Russia, on Iran clear, and I think the steadier we stay, the more likely there is the chance that Iranians will come to the conclusion that this is not the answer to their question. On Syria, I can't even imagine what life will be like 3 or 5 years from now, other than just to echo the points that both my colleagues have made. First, that Senator Mitchell made, which is to say, Assad is finished. When he's finished, I don't know. But this is an illegitimate government that's now murdered 70,000, probably more, of its people. What comes next, I think, is a huge mystery, and one of the reasons that we need to continue to be engaged in the kinds of questions that Secretary Cohen was asking, I think are the right ones. So I have an optimistic view on the first, I have a realistic view on the second, in the sense of our own strength is key here, and I think nobody knows what happens in Syria.
You want me to go ahead?
You're closest. You're the next closest.
I always listen to my senior senator.
Well, we want Senator Mitchell to finish on an optimistic note. I'm a little more pessimistic, frankly, as I look at what's going on. If I look at today's news on Iraq, we brought democracy to Iraq. I think 208 people died this past week through bombings. And it's likely to continue at that level for some time to come. In Pakistan, I think there were 9 that died yesterday, a suicide bomber. We look at the numbers we've lost in Syria. I think, 80,000 killed, over 1 million displaced, 800,000, I believe, are in Jordan now. That have been displaced in Jordan. The Jordanian king, Abdullah, was in town last week. He indicated, think about that, that would be the equivalent of having 30 to 40 million people come into the United States in the last 6 months. And so they're being overwhelmed in Jordan. And it's hard to see how this is going to play out. We know Assad has got to go, but okay, what then? What's taking place in Iraq to give us confidence? What's taking place in Libya to give us confidence, since today's reports indicate that there are warring militias still vying for control in Libya. So it's going to have to play out. Senator Mitchell was saying over the long scope of time, it's going to take time. But we're living in a world in which it's more dangerous in the sense that warfare has been democratized. You know, terrorism's been democratized. Everybody now has access to the information, and thanks to the media, we know how to construct a bomb out of a pressure cooker and fertilizer, etc. So it's a much more dangerous world in the sense, not existentially, as Ambassador Burns talked about last night, but we're likely to see a proliferation of this type of bombing activity for much of our lives in the future. So it's hard to be optimistic about what's taking place over there, and maybe Ambassador Grossman's correct that the Palestinians and the Israelis will eventually sort it out. But I think as far as it's almost independent, the Israeli-Palestinians is almost independent from what is going to take place with respect to Syria and Iran. When I used to go throughout the Middle East, whenever I met with an Arab country, they would always give me a lecture saying, you've got to do more on the Israelis. They're not being fair to the Palestinians, and it's your fault, America's fault. When I go there now, they don't give me that lecture. You know what they talk about? They talk about Iran. They're all terrified that Iran is going to acquire a nuclear weapon. And as Senator Mitchell has said, if that takes place, the Saudis will acquire one. Egypt eventually would get one, UAE, all the others would feel compelled to have a comparable capability. So there goes your non-proliferation regime. And what does that mean for the rest of the world? So raising the issue about they shouldn't be allowed and can't be allowed, we'll say, how do we stop it? For me, we really don't have that much control over it compared to, let's say, China. And I've had this discussion with the Chinese that basically there's a China card to be played, and the card has to be played by China itself. If the Iranians come to the conclusion that all of the powers are aligned against them, that Russia and China have joined with the United States and the French and the Brits and others, to say this is unacceptable for you to do this, then I think there's a chance that war can be avoided. Absent that, I think seeing the slow evolution toward a nuclear capability is going to put more pressure on the Israelis, who now will have greater tanker capability, so they can fly further distances if they have to, and that would be in one direction I can think of quite quickly. And so I think China and Russia really have more to do at this point in terms of joining us in intensifying the sanctions in order to prevent a war from taking place, because I think if a war takes place, all of the horrors that Senator Mitchell touched upon, or at least just hinted at, will come to pass. If you have a war with Iran, it will have untoward consequences that we haven't begun to contemplate at this point. So I think it's good to be optimistic, but you have to be optimistic in the sense we've got to work harder, and we've got to persuade our friends that this is the way we have to join together. We have to persuade the Russians to help us in Syria. They have a direct involvement with the Syrians. We need Russia to participate in Syria. We need the Chinese to participate with us in Iran. And if we do those things, then there's hope for the future. But it's going to take that kind of dedication.
Well, the human ability to predict future events is very limited, and mine is especially limited, I think, but I'll respond as best I can. With respect to Syria, I think within 3 to 5 years, Assad will have long been gone. I believe there will have been a bloody internal contest for succession, most likely ended with a Muslim Brotherhood-led government of hopefully moderate tendencies, similar to what now exists in Egypt. I think they'll encounter the same problems that they've encountered in Egypt. The Brotherhood had a good slogan when it was in opposition, when it had no responsibility or authority to make decisions. Islam is the answer. That was their slogan. It proved to be just a slogan. They took power in Egypt, and they have been unable to produce what the people of Egypt started this whole revolution over, and that is jobs, education, opportunity, the absence of crony capitalism, and so forth. I think there will be a learning curve, and let's hope, it's very important to us and to Israel, that the situation in Egypt stabilize, and let's hope for the best, which is something along the lines that I just described with respect to Syria, which poses an interesting question that I ask of all of you. The founding, one of the 2 charter documents of the United States is a Declaration of Independence, the central premise of which that there is a right of people to govern themselves. We believe in that 100% when it comes to us. My question is, do we believe in it when it comes to others who, when they exercise democracy, produce regimes that are hostile to us? How committed are we to the right of self-governance when it acts in a manner that is adverse to our interests in the region? It's a rhetorical question. Not much discussed in this country, but I think we should discuss it because it's going to occur more and more. Now, with respect to Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think that within 5 years there will be a resolution, because I think it's so much in their self-interest to do so, not because it will be without risk or pain. It will involve great pain and significant risk for both sides, particularly for Israel, but because the alternative will involve far, far greater risk for both, and again, especially for Israel. Right now, there are 5,800,000 Jews living in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. There are about 5,300,000 Arabs, including Israeli Arabs, Palestinians in the West Bank, and Gaza. The demographics are fixed. Without a doubt, in the next few years, the number of Arabs will exceed that of Jews, probably in the 12-month period between 2015 and 2016. By 2020, there will be 500,000 more Arabs than Jews. As Ehud Barak has said many times, publicly, the former Prime Minister and Defense Minister, that will present to the people of Israel a choice they should not have to make. Because if the two-state solution is lost, they must then choose between being a democratic state or a Jewish state. And the alternatives to them should be unacceptable and unpalatable. Secondly, what is the risk to Israel if a Palestinian state is created in an agreement with the Palestinian Authority? It is that the authority will fail, that Hamas will take over, and that Israel will be confronted with a hostile state armed with rockets, but men who can stand in Palestine, fire a shoulder-fired rocket, and strike the airport at Tel Aviv. That's a risk. But the risk of the Palestinian Authority failing and Hamas taking over is much greater if there is no agreement. The Palestinians are divided. The Palestinian Authority is failing. Remember now, the Palestinian Authority has renounced violence, has recognized Israel's right to exist, and has established very effectively order, stability, and the prevention of terrorist acts against Israel staged in the West Bank. So much so that when I was the envoy, I had a steady stream of human rights groups coming to me and saying, well, look what they're doing. They're arresting these Hamas guys. They're without charges. They're keeping them in prison too long. This is a terrible thing. You Americans should insist that they not be so aggressive as against Hamas because they violate American concepts of justice. Well, it's a difficult balance to try to strike in that circumstance. My point is that it's very much in the interest of both. From the Palestinian side, in 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition that would have made Jerusalem an international city with access to all and divided the land, not quite equally, but substantially so. Israel accepted, the Arabs rejected it. They rejected it because there were then only 600,000 Jews in Israel. The Arab populations totaled scores of millions, and they thought they could win an easy victory. Well, they didn't, and Israel won that and every succeeding war. There is not a single Arab leader today with an ounce of common sense who would not gladly accept the 1947 offer that their predecessors rejected. But they won't have the chance to accept it because it's not on the table and never again will be on the table. Circumstances on the ground have changed so much. And the Palestinians have rejected the other offers. I said directly to Chairman Arafat in my first tour of duty there several times, and most recently I said very directly to President Abbas that you have been waiting 60 years for the perfect solution to come floating down from heaven. It hasn't come, and it's never going to come. And there is not a shred of evidence, not a shred of evidence to suggest that the offers are going to get any better in the future. In fact, the evidence is overwhelming that the longer this goes on, the more settlements will be developed, the offers will get less and less attractive. And so the Palestinians have got to do that which they have so far been unwilling to do, and that is sit down in negotiations directly with Israel with American participation. They can't do it directly themselves, with American participation, and negotiate the best deal you can get to get a state. Imperfect, less than what you want, you proclaim it as unfair, but you got to get your state and you got to build on it, and you ought to look at the example that Israel has provided in the way it has built a tremendously successful state in a very hostile region. And when they do that, as Bill said, the other Arabs...
So I got to leave.
When they do that, as Bill said, the other Arabs do recognize that their real threat comes from Iran, not from Israel. They might not like it, but they know Israel's there to stay. It isn't going anywhere. And their threat comes, and it's ancient, it's gone back centuries, the Persian-Arab conflict. They can then concentrate on opposing the real enemy once this issue with the Palestinians is resolved. And I think it's best for both sides, and ultimately I believe nations like individuals act out of self-interest.
Please join me in thanking Senator Mitchell, Secretary Cohen, and Ambassador Grossman. Gentlemen, thank you.
Peter, let me, on behalf of our firm and everybody in the room, thank you first, Peter, for doing such a wonderful job posing questions here today, as you've done for many years for us here, and we really appreciate that. And for the privilege of having the opportunity to listen to these three fabulous American patriots, and that we all are so lucky that not only did they serve the country, but that they continue to serve the country with their voices and their perspectives on what's going on out there. So thank you very much, Senator Mitchell, Secretary Cohen, Ambassador Grossman. Desserts being served outside. We will reconvene back here at 3 o'clock for our private equity panel and across the hall for a continuation of international discussions. Thanks very much.